The candlelight of Harrowmere Hall blurred as Lady Evelina Ashworth pressed her back against the cold marble pillar. She had not meant to eavesdrop, but the Duke's voice, low and indifferent, cut through the string quartet's melody with the precision of a blade. "Miss Ashworth." I barely recall her face. One of those pale, forgettable girls who haunt the edges of ballrooms, I suppose. Laughter, light and careless, rippled from his companion. Evelina's gloved hand tightened around her glass of ratafia, the crystal stem threatening to snap beneath her fingers. She had known he did not see her. No one truly did. But to hear it spoken so unremarkably, as if she were a piece of furniture one passes without thought, dismantled something fragile deep inside her chest. She remained motionless behind the cascade of ivy and shadow until the dance set ended and the laughter faded. No one came looking for her. They never did. At 23, she had perfected the art of stillness, of becoming part of the walls, the drapery, the air. Her aunt, Lady Brimley, had brought her to this country gathering as a duty, a charitable appendage to brighten the corners of a ducal estate. The Duke of Harrowmere, lord of all he surveyed, had not addressed her once in 3 days. Now she understood with awful clarity why. She was pale, forgettable, a ghost at the feast. Later that night, in the narrow chamber allotted to her at the end of a forgotten corridor, a pointed reminder of her station as the penniless niece of a disgraced baron, she sat before the spotted mirror and unpinned her hair. It fell in unremarkable brown waves, neither gold nor striking auburn. Her eyes, a quiet gray, held no coquettish sparkle. She had always known she was no beauty, but she had harbored a secret, fragile hope that her attentive stillness, her carefully ordered thoughts, might one day catch his eye. That hope curdled now into hot, silent shame. She blew out the candle and let the darkness swallow her, resolving that tomorrow she would be even less visible. It was safer to disappear entirely than to be seen and dismissed. Morning arrived with a pale sun that offered no warmth. The household stirred with plans for a shooting party and a picnic on the south lawn. Evelina slipped into the breakfast room early, hopping to avoid the crush. The Duke was already there, a newspaper folded beside his plate, his profile carved against the dawn-lit window. He looked up as she entered, and for a fleeting, treacherous instant their eyes met. She curtsied, a quick mechanical dip, and moved toward the sideboard. "Good morning, Miss Ashworth," he said, his tone polite and entirely empty. She murmured a reply, her heart hammering against her ribs. He returned to his paper. She had been acknowledged and discarded in the space of a single breath. The stone of the previous night settled deeper beneath her ribs as she took her toast and tea to the farthest end of the long table, eating alone while the sun climbed indifferently over the manicured hedges. At the picnic, she seated herself on the outermost edge of the blankets, close enough to a sprawling oak to feel invisible. Children raced along the lake's edge, their shrieks blending with the clink of glasses and the hum of society conversation. She watched a young boy, the son of a local baronet, chase a ball too close to the water, his governess distracted by a footman. When the child slipped on the mossy bank and tumbled into the lake with a startled cry, Evelina was already on her feet. She did not scream or call for help. She simply gathered her skirts, waded into the shockingly cold water, and caught the flailing boy by the collar before the current could drag him deeper. By the time others registered the commotion, she was lifting the sodden, coughing child onto the grass, her muslin dress plastered to her legs, her hair coming loose in dripping strands. The governess burst into hysterics, but Evelina spoke quietly to the boy, stroking his back until he calmed. Only then did she look up and find the Duke standing 10 feet away, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed not on the child but on her. Heat rushed to her cheeks, and she quickly looked away, suddenly mortified by her drenched appearance. Lady Brimley rushed forward not to praise her, but to hiss about ruined silk and the importance of not drawing attention. Evelina wrapped herself in a proffered shawl and retreated to the house without another word, feeling the Duke's stare like a physical weight upon her back. That evening, unable to sleep and still smarting from her aunt's reprimand, she crept to the library. She had discovered it on her first day and had considered it a sanctuary. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across leather-bound spines. She traced a finger along a volume of Seneca and sighed, allowing herself a moment of unguarded peace. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun and found the Duke standing in the doorway, a single candle in his hand, his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly mussed. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "I owe you an apology." Her throat tightened. "I cannot imagine what for your grace." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "This morning I called you forgettable. I was wrong. What you did at the lake was not the act of a forgettable woman." The words hung in the air. She should have felt vindication, but instead a fresh ache bloomed, because he had remembered, yes, but only after she had proven useful. She inclined her head, her expression carefully blank. "Good night, Your Grace." She slipped past him and into the darkened hall, leaving him standing alone, a flicker of something she could not name kindling behind his eyes. The next morning, Evelina rose before the household and took her sketchbook to the east garden, where the roses climbed a weathered trellis, and the dew still clung to every petal. She had learned years ago that solitude was the only reliable comfort. As her charcoal moved across the page, she let her mind drift away from the Duke's words, his unexpected apology, the way his gaze had chased her from the library. She was so absorbed that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel until a shadow fell across her paper. "You draw." Looked up sharply. The Duke stood there in riding boots and a bottle-green coat, a crop tucked under his arm. This time his expression held something new, a flicker of genuine curiosity. "May I?" He gestured to the sketchbook. Reluctantly she turned it toward him. He studied the half-finished rose, the thorns rendered with as much care as the bloom. "You've captured the way the light falls. Most artists ignore the shadows." She did not know how to respond. The compliment felt like a trick, a baited hook. "I find shadows more truthful than light," she said at last. He looked at her then, truly looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "You are an unusual woman, Miss Ashworth." The words, intended perhaps as praise, stung. Unusual meant not normal, not what was expected, still an oddity. She closed the sketchbook and stood. "I must return to my aunt." He fell into step beside her without invitation. "I would like to show you the conservatory. There is an orchid that blooms only once a year. I think you would appreciate it." Evelina's heart stumbled, but she kept her pace steady. "I am sure Lady Cecilia or one of your other guests would be a more appropriate companion." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I did not ask Lady Cecilia. I asked you." The simple declaration sent a traitorous warmth through her, but she quelled it fiercely. She had heard his careless dismissal with her own ears. One act of heroism did not transform her into someone worthy of his sustained notice. "Perhaps another time, Your Grace." She left him standing in the garden, the morning birdsong filling the silence she left behind. She avoided him for the remainder of the day, a feat made easier by the arrival of new guests, including the vivacious Lady Cecilia Thornton, whose golden ringlets and tinkling laugh seemed to occupy every corner of the house. At dinner, Evelina was seated so far from the Duke that she might as well have been in another room. Sir James Pemberton, a gentle-eyed baronet with a stammer, occupied the chair beside her, and she found herself unexpectedly grateful for his kind, unassuming conversation. He spoke of his orchard and his mother's health, and she listened without the exhausting performance high society demanded. When she laughed at his self-deprecating joke about his prize-winning turnips, she felt rather than saw the Duke's gaze snap toward her from the head of the table. The weight of it lingered through the fish course and into the pheasant. She did not return the look. After the ladies withdrew, leaving the gentlemen to their port, Evelina stood by the drawing-room window, watching the moon silver the lake where she had pulled the boy from the water. Lady Cecilia glided up beside her, a vision in lavender silk. "You made quite an impression on our dear Duke, I'm told," she said, her voice sweet as poison honey. "Rescuing children is so very dramatic. One wonders if it was planned." Evelina turned, meeting the other woman's crystalline blue eyes. "I doubt any child would willingly tumble into a lake to enhance my reputation, Lady Cecilia." A few nearby matrons tittered behind their fans. Cecilia's smile tightened fractionally. "No, I suppose not. But then, a woman in your position must seize any opportunity, mustn't she? She glided away before Evelina could reply, leaving the sting of public belittlement in her wake. When the gentleman joined them, the Duke's eyes scanned the room until they found Evelina. He crossed to her directly, ignoring the flutter of hopeful faces. "Miss Ashworth, would you do me the honor of a turn about the conservatory? The orchid I mentioned is in bloom." Every conversation in the room seemed to pause. Evelina felt Lady Cecilia's gaze like a dagger between her shoulder blades. To accept would invite gossip, envy, and further humiliation from those who already deemed her a social climber. To refuse would be to insult a duke. She rose with quiet dignity. "A brief turn, Your Grace. My aunt will expect me shortly." The conservatory was a cathedral of glass and shadow, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. The orchid stood on a pedestal, its petals an impossible shade of midnight blue. The Duke stood close behind her, his reflection ghostly in the glass panes. "I find myself thinking of you," he said quietly. "More than I should." Her heart hammered, but her voice remained steady. "I am a novelty, Your Grace. A quiet woman who reads Seneca and does not simper. You will grow bored of the puzzle soon enough." She turned to face him, and for the first time she saw something vulnerable flicker in his guarded eyes. Before he could answer, the sound of footsteps and Lady Cecilia's silvery laugh approached. Evelina stepped back, increasing the distance between them. "Thank you for showing me the orchid. It is beautiful." She left without looking back, her pulse a frantic rhythm, the Duke's gaze burning a path behind her. 3 days passed in a careful dance of avoidance and accidental encounters. The Duke sought Evelina out with a persistence that alarmed her as much as it thrilled her. He appeared in the library during her early morning reading, in the garden when she sketched, beside her at the archery targets when she had been pressed into participating. Each time, he offered quiet remarks, genuine questions, a steadiness of attention that slowly, treacherously, began to erode her defenses. She started to notice the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he was amused, the thoughtful pauses before he spoke, the way he listened, truly listened, when she expressed an opinion on a book or the estate's crop rotation. He was not merely humoring her. The realization filled her with a dangerous, unnameable hope. The shift came during a formal dinner held in honor of the Dowager Duchess's birthday. Evelina had been placed, by some clerical miracle or deliberate interference, only 3 seats from the Duke. She wore a gown of dove-gray silk, the only fine dress she possessed, altered twice from her aunt's cast-offs. She felt almost pretty in the candlelight, a fragile sensation she distrusted immediately. During the soup course, the Duke addressed her directly across the table. "Miss Ashworth, I was hoping you might settle a debate. Lord Addington here insists that the novel is an inferior art form. I recalled your defense of Richardson last week and thought you might enlighten him." The table fell silent. A dozen pairs of eyes swiveled to her. Lord Addington, a ruddy-faced earl, raised an eyebrow. Evelina's fingers tightened on her spoon, but she refused to look away. "I would not presume to instruct his lordship," she said evenly. "But I do believe the novel allows us to inhabit another's moral choices in a way no sermon can. Empathy, my lord, is the root of all virtue, and a well-crafted story cultivates empathy." A murmur rippled. Lord Addington looked startled, then grudgingly amused. The Dowager Duchess, a formidable woman in purple velvet, studied Evelina with narrowed eyes. The Duke's gaze held a warm, proprietary pride that made Evelina's stomach flip. Lady Cecilia, seated closer to the Dowager, set down her wine glass with a delicate clink. "How refreshing to have such strong opinions from a young lady, though one does wonder, Miss Ashworth, if too much novel reading might give a woman ideas above her station." The implication landed like a whip crack. Evelina felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could respond, the Duke spoke, his voice dangerously calm. "I find a well-read mind an asset in any station, Lady Cecilia. It saves one from the tedium of shallow conversation." Cecilia's lips pressed into a thin line. The Dowager's fan snapped open, a silent warning directed at her grandson. Evelina excused herself from the table as soon as the meal ended, her heart a riot of humiliation and confused gratitude. She fled to the terrace, desperate for cold air, for silence, for the familiar comfort of invisibility. The night sky stretched vast and indifferent above her. She gripped the stone balustrade and forced her breathing to slow. He had defended her, publicly, decisively. But the dowager's expression had promised retribution, and Lady Cecilia's malice would not rest. She was a penniless niece with a scandal-tinged name. He was one of the wealthiest dukes in England. Whatever fragile connection was forming between them, it could end only in her destruction. Footsteps sounded behind her. She did not turn. "You should not have followed me, Your Grace. People will talk." "Let them." His voice was rough at the edges. He stopped so close that she could feel the warmth of him against the chill. "I cannot bear to see you diminished by the Cecilias of the world. You are worth 10 of them." She closed her eyes, steeling herself. "And yet in the eyes of society I am worth less than the hem of her gown. You know this. Your grandmother certainly knows it." Silence. She turned then and met his gaze. "You defend me tonight, but what of tomorrow? What happens when the novelty truly fades and I am left with the ruins of a reputation while you move on to the next curiosity?" He flinched as if struck. "That is not, I would not. You do not know what you would do," she whispered. "And that is the problem." She walked past him, back into the glittering ballroom, leaving him motionless on the terrace, the first true crack forming in his careful composure. The scandal arrived the next morning, sharp and swift as a blade. A rumor spread through the house that Evelina Ashworth had been caught alone with the Duke on the terrace, that she had lured him out there with calculated intent, that she was a fortune hunter of the lowest order. The whispers followed her like a poisonous fog when she entered the breakfast room. Lady Cecilia sat at the center of a cluster of young ladies, her expression one of theatrical pity. "Poor dear," she murmured just loudly enough to carry. "One does feel sorry for those who must resort to such desperate measures." Evelina did not flinch. She walked to the sideboard with her head high, poured her tea with steady hands, and took a seat alone by the window. Inside, however, a storm raged. She had known this would happen. She had practically predicted it. And yet the reality of it, the eyes sliding away, the sudden cessation of conversation when she passed, settled over her like a shroud. At mid-afternoon, the Dowager Duchess summoned her to the private parlor. The old woman sat in a high-backed chair, her cane resting against her knee, her eyes hard as flint. "Miss Ashworth, I will be direct. You will leave Harrowmere by tomorrow morning. A carriage will take you back to your aunt's cottage. Whatever designs you harbor upon my grandson, they end now." Evelina's voice, when she found it, was remarkably calm. "I have no designs, Your Grace. I have never asked for the Duke's attention, nor encouraged it." "Do not dissemble. A woman in your circumstances does not need to ask. Her very presence is a petition." The injustice of it stole her breath. Before she could respond, the door swung open and the Duke strode in, his face pale with fury. "Grandmother, that is enough." The Dowager's grip tightened on her cane. "You forget yourself, Alexander." "No, I have remembered myself rather too late." He looked at Evelina, and something raw and urgent burned in his eyes. "Miss Ashworth, please wait in the library. I will join you shortly." She did as he asked, though her legs shook. In the library she stood by the window, watching the afternoon light fade behind gathering clouds. When the Duke entered an hour later, he looked exhausted, his cravat askew. "The rumor has been addressed," he said hoarsely. "I made it clear that it was I who sought your company, not the reverse. Anyone who repeats the slander will answer to me directly." Evelina hugged her arms around herself. "You cannot silence every whisper, and your grandmother, she has made her position plain. I am to leave tomorrow." He crossed the room in 3 strides. "I will not allow it. I will speak to her again." "To what end?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Will you offer me marriage, Your Grace? Will you defy your family, your name, your entire world, for the daughter of a disgraced baron who has not a penny to her name?" The question hung in the air, brutal and necessary. His hesitation lasted only 3 heartbeats, but it was enough. She saw the war in his expression, the pull of duty, the weight of centuries of expectation, the fear of upending everything he had been raised to protect. She had her answer. She smiled, a soft, terrible thing. "I thought not. It is not your fault. You are what you were made to be. But I will not be your experiment, nor your hidden indulgence. I deserve more than half measures." She walked past him to the door. "Please do not follow me this time." He did not. But as the door clicked shut, she heard something fragile shatter, perhaps a vase, perhaps his composure. She did not look back. Evelina did not leave the next morning. The dowager, whether from her grandson's pleading or a strategic retreat, did not force the issue. Instead, a strained truce settled over the house, a brittle peace that everyone felt but no one acknowledged. Evelina moved through the days like a woman in a dream, performing the necessary pleasantries while building an invisible wall around her heart. She stopped attending events where the Duke would be. She took her meals on a tray in her room, pleading a headache. She sketched in the far corners of the estate where no one thought to look. She was, in effect, practicing the art of leaving while still present. The Duke, for his part, did not approach her for 5 days. She saw him from a distance, riding out at dawn, his face set in hard lines, or standing in the great hall surrounded by papers, his manner distracted and short. Lady Cecilia, emboldened by the visible rift, draped herself over his arm at every opportunity. He tolerated it with a stiffness that suggested his mind was elsewhere entirely. Evelina told herself it did not matter. She had already begun to untie the invisible knots that had bound her to him. It felt less like heartbreak and more like a slow, deliberate amputation. On the 6th evening, a note was slipped under her door. It was a single line in a bold hand. "Meet me in the East Garden at moonrise. I will not keep you long." Her fingers trembled and she nearly threw it into the fire. But some stubborn, unhealed part of her wanted to see him one last time, to close the chapter properly. She went. The garden was silver in shadow, the roses she had once sketched now ghostly in the moonlight. He was already there, standing by the trellis, his hands clasped behind his back. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice roughened by something she dared not name. "I have been a coward." She waited, her hands folded at her waist. "I have spent 5 days trying to imagine my life without you in it. I cannot. I do not want to." He stepped closer, and the moonlight carved the anguish on his face. "Evelina, may I call you that?" She gave a small nod. "Evelina, I care for you more deeply than I have ever cared for anyone. But the question you asked me in the library about marriage, I need you to understand. It is not that I do not wish to offer you my name. It is that my grandmother holds the purse strings until I am 30, and she has threatened disinheritance, the ruin of the tenant families dependent on the estate. She would do it. She is that ruthless." Evelina listened, her heart a clenched fist. "So you offer me what exactly? A discreet arrangement? A life in the shadows while you eventually marry a woman like Lady Cecilia to appease your grandmother?" He flinched. "No, I offer you my heart. I offer you a partnership. I will find a way to free myself from her control, but it will take time. I am asking you to wait, to trust me." The night air pressed in, thick with the scent of jasmine and impossible choices. She thought of the years of waiting she had already endured, waiting for notice, for respect, for a life that felt her own. She had only just begun to stop waiting. "I cannot," she said, and the words cost her everything. "I have spent my whole life waiting for other people to decide I am worthy. I will not do it anymore. If you love me, truly love me, you will come to me free, not half-bound, not hedging your bets, whole." She turned and walked away, her heart splintering with every step, but her spine straight as a blade. The remaining days of the house party passed in a numb blur. Evelina attended the final ball, not for the Duke, but for herself. She wore her dove-gray gown and allowed Sir James to lead her into a country dance. She laughed at his gentle jokes and accepted a glass of lemonade from Lord Addington, who had apparently decided she was a dashed clever little thing. She danced with 3 different partners, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with a defiance that felt, at last, like freedom. She no longer scanned the crowd for the Duke's reaction. She no longer cared. The Duke, however, watched from the edge of the ballroom like a man drowning. He saw Sir James's hand linger a moment too long at her waist. He saw Lord Addington's appreciative glance. He saw, with a pain that cut deeper than any wound, that she was not diminished by his absence. She was, impossibly, glowing. He had believed in some arrogant corner of his soul that she would pine, would wait, would remain his invisible admirer. Instead, she had become the center of the room without him. The jealousy that seized him was a physical thing, hot and nauseating. He wanted to stride across the floor, pull her away, claim her in front of everyone. But he had no right. He had forfeited that right through hesitation and half-promises. At midnight, a masquerade was announced for the following evening, a final celebration before the guests dispersed. Evelina saw an opportunity. She spent the next day altering a forgotten costume from a trunk in the attic, a silver domino and a mask adorned with tiny glass beads. When she entered the transformed ballroom, her face hidden, she felt a delicious, unfamiliar sense of power. No one knew her. She could be anyone. She danced with abandon, a waltz with a masked Sir James, who whispered that he wished he knew her name, a lively quadrille with a man she suspected was Lord Addington. She was laughing, breathless, when a hand closed around her wrist and pulled her into the shadowed alcove behind the orchestra. The Duke, dressed in black with a simple mask, stood before her. "I know it's you," he said, his voice raw. "I would know you anywhere." She did not deny it. "What do you want, Your Grace?" "I want you to stop torturing me." The arrogance of it ignited a spark. "I am not torturing you. I am simply living my life, one in which I am not waiting for your grand decision." He pulled off his mask, his eyes wild. "I cannot eat. I cannot sleep. I see your face everywhere. I am obsessed with you, Evelina." "Is that what you want to hear? That I am undone?" She removed her own mask slowly, meeting his gaze with a calm that surprised her. "No, I did not want obsession. I wanted partnership, and you could not give it." She made to leave, but he blocked her path. "I will find a way. I will go to London, petition the trustees, sell the unentailed land. I will do whatever it takes. Only please do not close your heart to me." The music swelled beyond the alcove, a waltz of impossible longing. She looked at him, this proud, disciplined man, now reduced to begging, and felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in her own wall, a dangerous ray of hope. "Do it first," she said softly. "Then come to me." She slipped past him and disappeared into the sea of masks. She returned to her aunt's cottage the next morning, her trunk packed, her heart a tangle of sorrow and strange, stubborn hope. The countryside settled around her like a quiet cloak. For 3 weeks she heard nothing from the Duke. Then letters began to arrive, not one but many, carried by a dusty courier who came every third day like clockwork. She read them in the garden, her hands trembling. He wrote of his battles with the trustees, the endless meetings, the sale of a beloved painting that had been in his family for generations. He wrote of his grandmother's fury and his mother's unexpected, tearful support. He wrote of his own stupidity, his blindness, his regret that he had ever made her feel like a contingency rather than a certainty. Each letter peeled back a layer of his guarded heart. She did not reply, but she kept every letter tied with a blue ribbon beneath her pillow. At the end of the 4th week, a carriage pulled up to the cottage. Evelina looked out the window and saw the ducal crest emblazoned on the door. Her heart stopped. The Duke stepped out, travel-worn and thinner than she remembered, but with a light in his eyes she had never seen before. He walked up the garden path as if approaching a throne. When she opened the door, he did not speak at first. He simply dropped to one knee on the worn flagstones. "I am free," he said, his voice breaking. "The entail is broken. The trust is mine. I have nothing to offer you but my name, my land, and a heart that has been thoroughly and irrevocably yours since the moment you waded into a lake for a child you did not know. Evelina Ashworth, will you do me the unbearable honor of becoming my wife?" She stood frozen, the breeze lifting the loose hairs at her nape. She had imagined this moment 100 times, but the reality was sharper, more terrifying. Could she trust it? Could she trust him? She looked at his upturned face, at the vulnerability and the fierce hope warring there, and made a decision. "You once called me pale and forgettable," she said. He winced. "I have been a fool of the highest order." "Yes, you have." She extended her hand slowly, and he took it as if it were made of spun glass. "But I have also been invisible my whole life, and you are the first person who ever truly saw me, even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost you." She pulled him gently to his feet. "Ask me again in a month when the gossip has settled and you have had time to reconsider. If your heart has not changed, neither will mine have." He looked shattered but not defeated. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, a promise sealed in silence. He left the cottage, but before stepping into the carriage, he turned. "1 month, then. I will count the days." She watched the carriage disappear into the lane, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that she was not waiting for someone to choose her. She had already chosen herself. Everything else was simply the world catching up. A month later, on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves had turned to gold and rust, a letter arrived that was not from the Duke but from the Dowager Duchess. Evelina opened it with trepidation, expecting a final, cutting blow. Instead, the old woman wrote in a spidery hand, "My grandson has become insufferable. He speaks of nothing but you. He has sold a Rembrandt and alienated half the peerage. I am too old to fight such folly. If you must have him, come and do so properly. I shall expect you at Harrowmere for tea." A reluctant chuckle escaped Evelina's lips. It was not quite a blessing, but it was a surrender. She did not go immediately. Instead, she wrote to the Duke, inviting him to visit her at the cottage. He arrived the next day, the carriage clattering up the lane as if he could not wait a moment longer. She met him in the garden where the last roses clung defiantly to the trellis. "I received your grandmother's letter," she said, her eyes dancing. He stared at her, then laughed, a full, surprised sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "She wrote to you." Meddling old, I should have known she would bypass me entirely. Sobering, he stepped closer. "Evelina, I have counted every hour of this month. My heart has not wavered, it will never waver. I am yours, whole and unhedged, if you will still have me." She looked at him, this man who had been distant, proud, and unreachable, now standing before her with his entire soul in his eyes, and felt the last of her walls dissolve. "Yes," she said, and the word was a homecoming. "Yes, Alexander, I will have you." The wedding was small, held in the village chapel with only a handful of guests. Sir James, who beamed and stammered through a toast, Lord Addington, who claimed credit for recognizing her brilliance first, Aunt Brimley, who alternated between sniffles and smug pride, and the Dowager, who sat in the front pew, her cane planted firmly, her expression one of grudging approval. Lady Cecilia did not attend, having decamped to Bath with her mother after the engagement was announced. After the ceremony, the Duke and his new Duchess walked through the gardens of Harrowmere, now her home. The conservatory orchid had bloomed again, impossibly blue. He plucked it and tucked it into her hair, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "I once thought silence was a form of weakness," he murmured. "But your silence was the strongest thing I've ever known. It was a fortress. I am humbled you let me in." She leaned into his touch, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I did not let you in. You built your own door." He kissed her then, slow and reverent, as the autumn sun sank behind the ancient oaks and the first star of evening blinked into existence. They walked on, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, their shadows merging on the gravel path. Behind them, the great house glowed with candlelight, and before them stretched a future no longer defined by silence, but by a love that had been earned through patience, pain, and the quiet courage of a woman who learned to stop waiting and start living. The silence she had kept for so long was finally filled, with laughter, with whispered endearments, with the steady, unshakable rhythm of two hearts that had found their way home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next amazing story.